listening to Help Me, I'm a Comedian. It's a show where we ask a comedian to come in and share something difficult from their life, and a psychologist shares some insight onto that issue and tries to help out. You're joined now by comedian Amy Currie and psychologist Dr. Rachel Hannam from North Brisbane Psychologists. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hi, Ashwin.
Rachel, what is ADHD?
Well, ADHD stands for, as most people probably know, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. So like a lot of diagnoses in psychology and psychiatry, it has an unfortunate sounding name, in a way. But it does speak to the fact that people who are diagnosed with ADHD struggle with attention in certain ways, sustaining attention, focusing their attention, perhaps listening. It's when it's diagnosed in children, perhaps, which is more likely in boys. Perhaps they don't listen in class or follow instructions as well as the other children. And the hyperactivity part speaks to a heightened level of activity and energy and impulsivity.
Psychiatrists call it a disorder, but is there an evolutionary reason why these traits exist within us?
There's some theories about, because all behaviours and traits probably evolved and stuck around for a reason, right? And I like this theory. I've heard it from a psychiatrist that she says to the parents of the children she diagnoses, look, in tribal days, your son or daughter probably would have been a warrior. Yeah. They probably would have been brave and impulsive and thought, okay, that other tribe's coming to get us. I'm out there, I'm going to get them first, because they wouldn't have thought it through. So they might have been the entertainers. A lot of people I met with ADHD are, because of this impulsivity and hyperactivity, they can be high energy, very funny, and quite quick-witted.
Amy, can you tell us about that day you were diagnosed and what effect that diagnosis had on you?
Well, it was about 2 years ago now. I had, for a few months, been reading online, researching, finding out a bit more about ADHD after I had read some things that made me think, hang on, that sounds a bit like me. I had been going through a bit of a battle to try to get referred to a psychiatrist about it. My GP, who I'd had since I was a very little girl, didn't quite get it. It wasn't something that she had much experience with. And so when I first brought it up, it wasn't really something that she considered it might be. But I pushed for it and I got a referral to a psychiatrist. Unfortunately, the first psychiatrist that I saw misdiagnosed me and thought that I might be bipolar, which was not the case, very much not the case. But it left me feeling quite down about the whole process, and I thought, well, screw it, I've survived this long without it, I give up. But something in me made me keep going, and eventually I found a lovely psychiatrist who fortunately had a great deal of experience in these things and told me I was absolutely textbook. And it was one of the happiest days of my life because all of the stuff that had never made sense made sense.
Can you tell us about some of those things that now made sense?
I have always experienced the world as more difficult. I didn't realise that for a very long time. I have always been very, very clever and profoundly stupid at the same time. There was always just a not quite grasping social stuff, not being able to focus on things that didn't interest me, things that I liked. You could not keep me away from them. Things that I didn't like, it appeared that I refused to do them. And I couldn't figure out why I couldn't do these things that everyone else seemed to be able to.
Once you had this framework that was more compassionate through which to see yourself, it probably also brought up the grief and sadness of all those times that you judged yourself and thought, I'm crazy, or other people judged you.
Very, very much. And it also had me thinking about all the times that I had been trying so hard to achieve something and I couldn't make it happen. And I realised, well, the deck was a bit stacked from the start against me in some of those situations.
Rachel, is that a common story where people with ADHD feel like the world has not been fit for them, so they just come up with they grow up with such disappointment and embarrassment at the way they are, and they probably get shamed by their parents and friends for being misfits? Yeah.
Well, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to kind of cast a wider umbrella here about neurodiversity. Because ADHD is a form of neurodiversity. So, it's not something that can be fixed. I'd love to come back to what happened next. It'd be nice, I suppose, for some people to imagine that if they have ADHD or ASD, autistic spectrum disorder, or sensory processing disorder, or one of these neurodevelopmental issues, which we put under the category neurodiversity, that it could be fixed. But it's not a mental illness, right? It's just having a different kind of brain. And on top of having a different kind of brain, you experience the world as more overwhelming. You may experience shame and judgment from others, and then anxiety or depression may come. But it's against a backdrop of being neurodiverse. Now, neurodiversity is to be celebrated, in my opinion, because so many of our entrepreneurs, comedians, really successful people in the world are neurodiverse.
I think that a lot of little girls with ADHD do what I did, which was learn to mask. And learning to mask is a survival strategy, I suppose.
Yes.
But when it's something that you're doing so naturally, something that you do without even thinking about it, then when it gets taken off, you don't quite know who's underneath it. And once I'd had a diagnosis, there was a lot of stuff to undo, I suppose. I'd been misdiagnosed with severe depression and had been on a lot of medication since I was 15 years old. And I was diagnosed at 36. So after a long time being on that medication, first I had to come off that, which was an experience, and then find a new medication balance that worked. And I had so much to unpack, so much old stuff, so many assumptions about the world and who I was and my place in it. Any other time that I'm here at the ABC to speak into a microphone, it has always been me there going, we're doing our new comedy show tonight at blah, blah, blah theatre, like really upbeat and happy. And even now, it is so difficult for me not to do that. It's like a physical urge. It's very strange.
It's very vulnerable doing this podcast.
Everything in my brain is screaming at me to run away.
Emotionality is a personality trait, and a lot of ADHD women I know are high on emotionality. I'm also high on emotionality, if it makes you feel any better. And so some of that is out of your control. It's just how you are. And see if this resonates. It's only been 2 years since your diagnosis, so you are still very much in the integration process of integrating this new framework, this idea of self-compassion and self-acceptance into your life, and kind of reckoning the new information with all those years that came beforehand, and all the shame and all the masking and all the depression, anxiety and exhaustion and all of so there's such a recalibration, integration that has to happen here and is still happening. And I think maybe some of the emotionality that's coming through now, while it may be a personality trait, it's also a processing of all those emotions that you had to repress, or did repress, unconsciously, not a choice, which is what masking does, right? It represses vulnerability and it represses emotion. The emotions don't go away. At some level, they're still there waiting to be acknowledged, right? So I wonder if some of that's just still happening.
I very much feel like I got paused when I was 15 years old or so, because that's when I started taking quite severe antidepressant medication, and I have a hell of a metabolism for drugs, apparently. Like I had to have the pharmacist call up some sort of national hotline so I could get 3 times the maximum dose for an adult man. But essentially, I didn't have those highs and lows, that immense depth of feeling for 20 years. I was quite numb. I never cried. I felt like I couldn't. And then bang, it's back. It's very embarrassing to weep over something fairly small from sadness, but it is quite lovely to be able to cry because I'm moved by a song or a painting. And I didn't know that would happen, so that's been good.
The disorder ADHD seems to drive into this question of what's normal and what's abnormal.
So in psychology and psychiatry, it's such a shame we use the word disorder, and it's got this real stigma around it. But the reason for the word disorder is simply because if a pattern of internal and external experiences and behaviours interferes with a person's life so much that it makes it difficult to function, difficult to look after yourself, difficult to study or work, then it's interfering with the order of your life, right? So we call it a disorder. It's not meant to be demonising, so it's a shame in a way that we call these things a disorder, but the spirit of the word is it's interfering with your ability to function in the way that you want to, right?
I hadn't thought of it that way. I like that very much.
Yeah. So we want to take the stigma out of the word disorder. You're not disordered, it's just that it kind of really gets in the way of your life.
So is that a case that now that you've had this diagnosis, you want to redesign your life to take advantage of your strengths and not do things that made you feel stupid because your skills didn't fit with that particular restriction? Now you want to take advantage of your talents in whatever you do next.
Absolutely. And it took a little while for me to get there, to come around to that way of thinking. But it became apparent more and more so that I could not go back to trying to fit in. I could not attempt to shove a square peg into a round hole. And I'm not quite sure what my life should look like. What would be a thing that I would like to do? And just trying to figure that out has been really weird but good.
Can I ask a quick question about that?
Yeah.
I love the difference. Brené Brown makes a distinction between fitting in and belonging. Fitting in is an attempt, all the stuff you described before, right? An attempt to manage the impression, that you manage other people's perceptions of you, right? So that you're like them in some way or will be liked by them. That's fitting in. But belonging is where you're accepted for who you are. You're accepted and respected for all of your unique strengths and weaknesses, and you feel that acceptance from others. My question is there anywhere in your life, anyone in your life or any group where you do feel that?
Yes, I am very fortunate that my fiancé is absolutely wonderful and puts up with all of my shit. He accepts me totally. And it is almost like not having a mask on at all when you are with people who you feel you can really be yourself around.
You feel like you belong.
Yeah, but I find it difficult to get to that point, and it's something I'm practicing.
I'd like to take you back to that point you made earlier, that you feel you're about to disappoint people. Can you tell me about what that is?
I am constantly in the state of standing by for the moment when I mess it all up. It feels to me that if things are going well, then any second now, a massive hole is going to open up in the ground, completely of my own doing, probably, and ruin everything. Because that's the experience that I've had, or at least that's how I remember it. Perhaps it wasn't quite as bad, but it feels to me that over the years I have managed to disappoint people in some way, and I'm bracing myself for the moment when I forget to send the email or I just couldn't do the work.
You're listening to ABC Radio. This is a show called Help Me, I'm a Comedian, and you're hearing from comedian Amy Currie and psychologist Rachel Hannam. We're talking today about ADHD. Amy, you mentioned earlier about feeling that you could have achieved so much more in your life, and if someone else is, like yourself, diagnosed in their 30s and 40s, and they look back in their 20s and they think, if only I'd just known, I would have become a performer at 20 or something like that. Can you tell us about that sense of disappointment about what you could have achieved? And also, Rachel, you might talk about the interpretation as well, because I'm sure that's a way you can beat yourself up.
There's a real sense of grieving for me, at least at first, because it did make me think of all the times that the odds were stacked against me. And I hadn't realised it in the moment. The university degree that I didn't complete, things like that, the perceived failures through the years. Looking back on them and realising that was because of how my brain is wired blew my mind quite a lot. I remember being in year 9 and my geography teacher was also my English teacher. and I'd entered a competition on a whim. And I ran in and saw her in the hall one morning. And I said, Miss, you'll never guess what's happened. I've just come second in the state in a short story writing competition. I was so happy. And she said, well, that's fine, Amy Currie, but you also got 17 out of 70 on your geography test. And that's pretty much my entire academic career in one anecdote. Mm-hmm. And everyone was so frustrated with me, like, why can't you live up to this potential?
And you didn't, because you weren't diagnosed, you didn't get any coaching, any strategies, any, support to find ways to, maximise your strengths and cope with the liabilities that come with ADHD. You didn't have any of that.
Can you tell us about your mum's impact on you growing up?
Throughout my childhood, she always knew that there was something I needed help with, that there was some issue, and I must have been to every specialist in Brisbane, and she never gave up trying to find what it was. And again she got told, you've just got a clever, naughty little girl.
And back then, girls didn't get diagnosed with ADHD very much.
No. So I really, really feel for my mum, who tried so hard to help. And she was there with me when I finally got diagnosed. I brought her in with me, and I remember afterwards we walked out of the psychiatrist's office and we were both just crying and hugging because there was a reason.
A reason for all your struggles.
Yeah, yeah, and that was incredibly liberating.
And you said your family also got diagnosed with ADHD. Can you tell us about what happened after you?
Well, it has been incredible to find out that it is biological. It is something hardwired, so hardwired that it is a family trait. And that provided me with a really weird amount of comfort. It felt like if this is a thing that my whole family has, then it is not something I'm doing wrong. It is hardwired into us.
And we now have the data, and it's very recent, that there are genetic risk factors for ADHD and other developmental and mental health conditions, but it's very recent data. I'm talking within the last 5 years.
Amy, what would you like people to know about someone who has ADHD? You know, how you should act towards them, what sort of empathy you should have to what they're going through?
I think the most important thing is it is real. We are not being dramatic or lazy or trying to get out of something. If a person who has been diagnosed with ADHD says to you that they are struggling with something and it doesn't make any sense to you because you could easily do that, it's still real. And because something cannot necessarily be seen on the surface, it doesn't mean that your friend isn't suffering from it. And just showing compassion and respect to what people struggling with this condition say to you. Just give us what we ask for, basically.
You said you got misdiagnosed with bipolar. Because one of the things, and tell me if this is your experience, people with ADHD who I've worked with, because they can have that hyperfocus, because they can have such passion and energy for particular topics, you know, they can really put a lot of energy there. And because they can mask and do all the people-pleasing, impression management stuff, they can get really tired and sleep a lot. Has that been your experience?
Yes. Sleeping and sleep issues are another, perhaps not immediately recognisable as ADHD thing, but yes, very, very much so. Sleep regulation is an issue as well. I tend to go nocturnal if I'm left to myself. Like, I would quite happily regularly go to sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning, wake up at 10 o'clock, and I would be perfectly happy with that.
In your mind, what's the difference between you and your symptoms? Do the lines get blurred?
That has been a big thing for me, to be honest. Since I was diagnosed, I kept finding out more and more details about symptoms that I kind of thought were just my personality. So that's been really, really odd. Everything from when I like to go to bed, almost everything, it seems, can be linked to something, and in my case a lot of those things were linked to ADHD. I do wonder stuff like I'm very creative would I be creative if I didn't have ADHD? What would my life be like if I didn't have ADHD? And just thinking which parts are standard issue human and which parts are my personality.
Yeah.
And which parts are this?
I think for all of us, it's hard to separate us from our biology, our environment, our culture. Which part is the real me and which part did I just absorb from being around these genes or these people? It's a complicated question for everyone. Did you find any answers to that search?
Look, I think the best answer I came up with was, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because, I think I would be quite different if I hadn't happened to have this particular roll of the genetic dice, but I did, and I wouldn't be me otherwise. I mentioned before that I have regrets about things that I didn't do or felt that I didn't succeed at in a way that I might have if I had not had ADHD. But all of these things have made me who I am, and I don't mean that in the trite soundbite sort of way. I mean in a genuine way. I have learnt skills, I have explored interests that have all added up to me now, and that just would not have happened if I had not had ADHD.
I feel like the world is getting friendlier towards ADHD, the 4-hour work week, working from home, more creative professions, online businesses. We're getting out of our old prisons. I think the world, I don't know, are you finding that there's more options for you now to find a lifestyle that suits your mindset?
It's absolutely getting better. I think people aren't necessarily locked into, report to this company the day after you graduate from uni and in 40 years you can have a gold watch and die.
Amy talked earlier about the difficulty of getting diagnosed, even psychiatrists getting this wrong. How much of a problem is getting a accurate ADHD diagnosis these days?
Well, broadly, it can be hard to get the right diagnosis, and psychiatrists and psychologists can disagree with each other, and it frequently does happen. So my heart goes out to anybody who's on a journey of getting the best diagnosis in order that it provides what I call a compassionate framework through which to see yourself, or a compassionate lens, which definitely has been your case by the sounds of it. Women with ADHD are much more likely to be misdiagnosed for all the reasons we've spoken about. The masking, lower testosterone levels, meaning the hyperactivity is not as obvious, things like that. But there's also, ADHD, just like ASD, are the backdrop, and then people experience the anxiety, the depression, the highs and lows, against the backdrop of the ADHD. So that's the presenting issue in the consulting room. It's the anxiety, it's the emotional dysregulation, it's the depression or something else. So often clinicians aren't, although it's changing, but clinicians aren't always looking for what could be underneath this. What's the deeper psychological issue here? And the other issue I want to mention is, because of this topic, and anyone listening, is there's a high comorbidity, and it's clearly not in your case, but there's a high comorbidity, which means existing at the same time. Again, terrible word. My world. Between ADHD and ASD.
What's ASD?
ASD is autistic spectrum disorder. So people have probably heard of Asperger's. And so I have a lot of clients who have traits of ADHD and Asperger's. So I wanted to put that in there because that's another complicating factor, is there can be, or sensory processing issues, you know, which is a separate disorder.
I will add with that, I realise that I'm quite articulate and I can make eye contact and all of that sort of thing. But when I am stressed, that goes down a lot.
Right.
Like sometimes it's like my social skills cut out. And I'm aware that there's a lot of crossover with the symptoms of ASD and ADHD, of course. But to me, for example, one of my family members who has recently been diagnosed, to put it bluntly, has a big scoop of autism and a dollop of ADHD on the top.
Nice, yeah.
My psychiatrist has not ruled out that I have a dollop of ADHD. And I find that that's a really interesting thing, how I can function quite well and then it can just drop out because of stress and anxiety.
And there's a reason for this overlap. I can tell you quite quickly, quite easily, why there is such an overlap sometimes between symptoms of ADHD ASD or Asperger's, and sensory processing disorders. And it's because all of them are about executive functions. And if you're interested in this topic, you can Google executive functions, and there's about 12 or so. Things like prioritizing, managing time, regulating your emotions, there's executive functions around how we relate to people and connect with people. So this is all that, as you were saying before, Ashwin, all that prefrontal cortex stuff. Now, it's a wheel of executive functions, so you might be really great at some and really struggle in others. But ASD and ADHD are about struggling with some of your executive functions, which explains what you just said. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It's it always feels very strange to me when I do experience an increase in symptoms like that, because it's the stuff that is very much part of me, abilities that I have. I speak well, I write well. That goes away if my executive function is compromised.
Yeah.
And that can be really, really scary. You feel like you're suddenly not quite yourself anymore.
Yeah, because the executive at the front of your mind, who's coordinating everything, has gone on holidays. So who is in charge?
Yeah. Anarchy.
I struggle a bit with time as well. I have time blindness. Basically, I don't quite trust time if I'm not keeping an eye on it. Like if I don't have 18 alarms set and the clock right in front of me, it gets away from me. It's a very slippery sort of thing. So I'm maybe compensating by being overly funny about that. It's and just being able to reframe it as this is an issue in the brain. That's actually incredibly liberating.
Rachel, you mentioned genes before. Are biologists going to come to the rescue on this topic and get more accurate at diagnosing ADHD in the brain so that people don't get misdiagnosed because perhaps the psychiatrist or the psychologist couldn't quite fit all the lifestyle pieces together?
I think psychiatry and psychology, and particularly the diagnostic side of it, will always be fraught because we're talking about the brain. And there are more synaptic connections between the synapses in the brain than stars in the universe or grains of sand on the planet.
Yeah.
Right? Pretty complicated. So it's there's a lot going on, and it's very complicated. It's multi-genetic. It's multifaceted. Diagnostic categories and labels are just our best approximation, and they're mainly useful for mental health clinicians to communicate with one another. That's the first purpose of them. And the second function of them is, only if they serve this function do they really serve you, is to give you that compassionate lens through which to see yourself. So you go, I'm not a weirdo, unless you embrace that term. I'm not crazy. I'm not stupid. I have ADHD. But I think that, it's science fiction still, the idea that we could get into your brain and I'm fine now, I'm neurotypical.
So you need a warrior mum to keep pushing you through and get that diagnosis.
You need a warrior mum.
Can recommend.
Amy, what's next for you in lifestyle? You've got this new insight into ADHD. What are you planning to do next with your life?
That's a very good question, and I look forward to finding out. At the moment, I'm still thinking about what my next steps are. But I'm enjoying writing a lot at the moment and hoping to get back onto a stage very soon.
You've been listening to Help Me, I'm a Comedian. I'm Ashwin Segkar, and you've also been hearing from comedian Amy Currie and psychologist Dr. Rachel Hannam.